I know, actually, I'm such a stage. Yeah. I just you should. Actually, still be ready to sing. I agree. I do have to.
Question, did somebody pour these and just leave them for anybody to grab, or did somebody pour them for their own use? There's 2 cups of water here. Anybody know? Hey! Hello there. Hi. What is this?
Hello, how are you? Nice to see you. This is for you. Join me for a minute. I don't know if I can fit in here, but I'll see.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, there's more. This is for your sister. From middle mail.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Marlowe. I chair the linguistics program. And I would like to welcome Lance Twitchell on behalf of the Linguistics Student Association. Unfortunately, our president of that organization isn't here. I don't know where he is or why he's late, but he's not here, so I'll
Right there.
introduce him. Nope.
Nope, that's not who are you waiting for?
Who are you waiting for?
So at any rate,
It's right here.
Just a real quick word about the Linguistics Student Association. So the Linguistics Student Association is a group of graduate students and undergraduates, mostly associated with linguistics, but anybody is welcome to join the group who is interested in language and language issues. The group this year started for the very first time and have managed to host 2 talks. One, remind me, Larry, the name is coming out of my head. David Bowie from UAA, and the second one, of course, is Lance Twitchell from UAS. They also hosted a small student conference this year that was very well attended, and students presented undergraduate and graduate research papers, ideas, etc. And we certainly hope that will happen again next year. So if you're interested in Linguistics Student Association, let me know, and I will make sure that you get into contact with the current chair and I'll say co-chair because I think she's technically like the secretary or something, but she seems to run the show. Okay. Pardon?
Erica's vice president.
Vice president. Sorry. Of course, I should be asking the linguistics graduate student. They know these things. All right, so I'd like to welcome Lance Twitchell from UAS, where he's an assistant professor of Alaskan Native Languages, is responsible for the Tlingit program there. Right. He's currently working on his PhD at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, very exciting institution, focusing on Hawaiian language and culture and indigenous language issues. So it's very exciting, and I'd like to talk to you about that as well. But of course, you didn't come to listen to me talk, so I'll just step aside for Lance.
Kawe. Punichish Khati Khatyuhan. UAF Linguistics Cup. Khunashtuka Khatati. Ashtukatyuhan Natusa Yiklik Hatsani Aya Yata. Khunakhawe Tuyake. Hayukatangi dot Kaktatani. Punichish. I want to thank you guys for the invitation. It means a lot to be invited to speak in different places. I want to thank the UAF community, the UAF Linguistics Department, and particularly the people who are, this is your ancestral homeland. It means a lot to recognize where you are, where you're speaking, and particularly when you're talking about indigenous language revitalization. So when I was putting this together, I have a habit of making way too many slides, and so we're just going to move through, and then we're going to have questions and a little discussion afterwards. I had a couple colleagues who asked if we could broadcast this on YouTube, so it's going to show the slides, and it's going to show, it'll have the audio. It's not going to show your faces on there. But it's great to see your faces. So many wonderful colleagues and former teachers of mine and a few former students of mine. It's fun to be back on this campus. I first attended UAF, I think in 2007, and finished in 2010. Had a one-year term assistant professor position with the English department. It was very fun. I knew it was a one-year position, but I loved the bureaucracy of the university when I got a notification of non-renewal of a non-renewable contract. It was very fun. And so we all love bureaucracy, maybe not particularly now. So I'm going to talk about a number of things, and they relate to Alaskan Native languages. While I was here at UAF, my focus was on English and creative writing. As I took a job down at the University of Alaska Southeast to work on the Tlingit language, my focus began to shift a lot more towards Alaskan Native languages and Alaskan Native studies. As far as who I am, my Tlingit name is Hune. My English name is Lance Twitchell. My mother's people are Haida. My mother's father's people are Tlingit. My father's people are Yupik. My father's mother's people are Sam. That's the primary sort of makeup of who I am. And I try to do a lot to honor those different parts. One thing I learned from being in Hawaii is they really say, love your land, love your language, love your ethnicity, I guess would be the way to translate it. And it's a lot of fun to look at what kinds of things they're doing and what kinds of things people are doing in similar situations where they're experiencing language revitalization. So there's 20 languages in Alaska. We can map them out. We've seen these maps before. This is based on one out of the Alaska Native Language Center. It shows the language families as well and how they're interconnected. But the things that we should kind of look at but not get stuck on, but are what's the rates of fluent speakers, basically. And so what we see in Alaska is we see a couple of languages that are doing pretty safe, but then we see a lot of trouble. And there's a lot of trouble in Alaska, and I think it's a crisis that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. I think there are communities of people who dedicate their lives and work very hard for this. But if there were 60 wolves left in the world, if there are 60 seals left in the world, if there are 60 polar bears or koala bears, or there's some species where there were 60 left, like they would rise up, they would do things, they would help out, there would be foundations and other things, and there would be global sort of awareness, I think. But when there's 60 speakers of the Tlingit language left, there's not a lot of people who know. And there's not a lot of people who say, well, what can I do? Where do we start? What's the real sort of causes behind this? And what would be some realities we could create where languages don't die? And that's the big thing that we talk about. So I'll show this, and so you see the darker on your way to black, that's where you've got potentially 0%, and it could be arguable, it could be, and I don't like to get stuck into who's a fluent speaker and who isn't. but based on some of the conversations I've had with language advocates, I think it's fairly close. And so I tend to talk mostly about the language I work in because I don't like to talk about other people's languages because they are the experts in those fields. Among the Tlingit people, there's about 25,000. We're at less than 1% fluency of our own people. So we are in tremendous trouble. We have a very complicated language, a very rich language, is very worth holding on to. And the other sort of narrative that we try to toy around with, me and some of my colleagues, is there's a lot of rhetoric out there about saving languages. But I think that the rhetoric has to be about the way that languages save people. And I think we can sort of make a lot of concrete connections. And I think in the world of academia, we're always looking for the hard data. Like, what's the data that ties this to this? What's the data that ties this to this? But in my heart, I know that if the languages go, the people will just keep dying, and the people will just keep suffering. So one of the terms that we use a lot is we say language shift. And so when we say language shift, we're talking about a community of people that are fluent, then they become bilingual. In this case, where we live, it's bilingual in English, and then they become monolingual in English. So this is what language shift is. And so reversing language shift would mean we're going to go the other way. We're going to go back towards bilingualism. Now in Hawaii, they have monolingual Hawaiian children, which is amazing. I would love to have that, but I think I would have to just say, I had my babies, we're going to go live away from everybody in a cabin. And I think that could happen. But in Hawaii, they're 2 or 3 generations into their model of language revitalization management. So these are the things that we're talking about. So back home, where we're from, these are my babies. There's 2 of them. We've got a 3rd one. When I had children with my wife, who's in the back right up there, we decided that I wouldn't speak English to the kids. I have 2 colleagues that were here at UAF that were a real strong inspiration for that. One is Jerry Brightwell, and the other is, at the time, Felina Draper. And I saw them interact with their kids, and they had this one parent, one language household. And I thought, well, why don't we do that? Because if that's the only language you speak, then they'll either, kids don't listen to you all the time anyway. Like this one, her name is Ava, and you gotta just, no matter what language you're speaking, you gotta just keep going at her because she lives in her own world. But they are totally responsive. Their fluency is very, very high. And I remember when my firstborn was a little over 1 year old, and I said, and I didn't do any gestures or anything. And she sat down and she took her socks off. And I thought, I don't know how that works. And we don't need to know how it works because it just works, how people learn languages. But in Southeast Alaska, we are in a point where this might be our last chance to have a connection with birth speakers who had a lot of speakers around them when they were growing up, and another generation of birth speakers. We're really trying to make some birth speakers and connect them because we feel like we can do a lot of documentation, we can do a lot of learning, we can do a lot of teaching. We are going to lose an awful lot of information and ability if we don't turn the corner very fast. So this map on the left shows traditional Tlingit territory and the estimated number of speakers in each of these communities. And this isn't just fluent elders who could tell you everything in the language. This is everybody, including second language speakers who are really just conversational. We're really trying to take an optimistic approach and say we have to start counting our second language learners. But then we also have to be aware that we have some communities already where the numbers got to 0. And we say, well, what do we do for our people in these different communities? So I've sent in some quotes from different elders who shared things with me. Some of these were said in English. This one was said in English. Some of them were said in Tlingit and have been translated. So Wushjahuish came to visit one of my classes, intermediate Tlingit, and he said, all of the big leaders across the United States, what did they fight for? Cochise, Geronimo, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull. They were fighting for the way of life as you are doing right here. And it was wonderful. I love to bring in fluent speakers to just engage the students that I have and to spend time with them and to talk to them. And it's a very neat reciprocal relationship because some of these speakers will say, well, I didn't think we were going to turn the corner, but then I see students who are learning and it helps me feel better. And for the students, they can have an elder come in who will encourage them to keep going and to keep trying. So there's a lot of educational challenges for Alaska Natives. And I want to frame this conversation with talking about what education is in Alaska and what it has been. I have some beliefs that a system cannot change fundamentally what it is if it never acknowledges what it is. And if we look at Alaskan education, I think we see a system that needs radical change. One of my colleagues, Paul Berg, says the time has passed for incremental change. When we look at, there's numbers in Alaska Native education, low graduation rates, we've got suicide, the leading cause of death among Alaska Native youth. We have Eurocentric curriculum all throughout Alaska. And you can go in some of the more remote sort of communities or places where their language is strong, and it won't be as much, but still you're going to have these standardized testing, you're going to have graduation requirements, you're going to have a number of different things. And I think one of the consistencies you get at education across all levels of Alaska is once you start implementing standards, those standards do not include Alaska Native ways of knowing or Alaska Native languages. And I think we have to look at that. It's highly problematic. As a system that is built upon racist principles of superiority and that we can do better. We can certainly do better. So these are, again, we look at some of this stuff, not to get stuck here, but just to say, well, where are we right now? And the reason that I like to say, well, where are we right now? Because I say, we can do better. We can do better than this. If we put the numbers out there and we look at these numbers, I don't think we need more committees and boards and organizations to examine it, studies. I think we need a systematic overhaul. And the systematic overhaul that I'm proposing is one that's under Indigenous control. So as you go higher in areas of education, you get lower percentage of Alaska Natives. And so one of the things that we talked about at the University of Alaska Southeast and with the Alaska Native Studies Council is we said, well, Alaska Natives are about 15 to 17% of the population, and Alaska Natives are about 2% of the faculty of the University of Alaska. And so we like to say, well, why is that? What do we do about that? And one of the things that we like to sort of ask is we say, if there's a hiring freeze, how are you going to get more diverse? So these are the types of questions that I've been pondering. So we go back, it's been 2 years since there was a group of folks. I can give you guys a little bit of history behind this act. I was invited to give a presentation to our Central Council of Tlingit and Haida tribe back home. And I talked about immersion schools and official languages, and those were sort of the two focus areas. And after I gave the speech, there was a politician who came up to me and he says, great speech, I don't think I agree with it. I said, okay. And there was another politician who said, that was great, what do I do? And then we met, and his name is Jonathan Christ Tompkins, and we outlined some different ideas. And I think I had a third one, which was Alaska Native languages as part of graduation standards. And so we started with this, and we looked at the bill, because at the time, we amended a bill that had been put forward in the 1990s that technically made Alaska an English-only state. There were not very many states that had some variation of an English-only law, but Alaska was one of them. So we just decided we had changed the official language to official languages, and we added 20 Alaska Native languages. And it was a really amazing process. It reveals how politics work. one of my colleagues who teaches government says when he sends interns to go work in the legislature, he tells them it's like watching sausage being made. And I think that's fairly accurate because we get to see some weird things. And so, but some of the things that we saw was the first committee that this bill went towards, they loved it. And we had glowing testimony from the Alaskan Native Language Center, from individuals. We had an elder in the room. I think I gave testimony. And people would, and somebody spoke Greek to us, and it was wonderful. It felt very good. I just thought, wow, this is great. And the second committee that we hit is when we started to hit road bumps. And some of the things that we heard, because I had testimony again, and we had elders, and they were politicking, and they took up the whole agenda, and they asked questions like, well, my ancestors spoke Norwegian when they came here, and then they stopped. Or my ancestors spoke Russian, and then they stopped. So people stop speaking languages when they come to America. So we had to explain, we didn't come from somewhere else. This is where we're from. If we stop speaking our languages, they are gone forever. And so luckily, those arguments were actually pretty easy to disrupt. And so it actually worked in our favor because then I could go home and write a very angry testimony and come back. And we were able to win those arguments. So it goes through the House unanimous. When it gets to the Senate, it's a different story. And so things start moving really slow and really strange. The short version of the long story is there are two senators from the Fairbanks and North Pole area who were against it. They probably represented other people who were against the idea. And what it fundamentally came down to is he came out in the hallway and argued with us, and he said, making equality just results in more racial tension. And it just made no sense whatsoever. So, and so luckily, and so as we were thinking about it, we said, when we were arguing for the anti-discrimination bill in the 40s, that is the exact same argument that was used. So luckily, nobody thought of a new argument in 70 years. But they voted against it, but they're totally out there. But now there are two states in the United States that have indigenous languages as official languages. So that does not mean success, but that means obligation. Because we didn't learn this from politicians, we learned it from Raven. We have this verb in Tlingit, which means to lie, to talk like Raven. So at one point, one of these politicians came out and they said, if we give you this, is that enough? Will you be done asking for things? And I said, yes, of course. But that wasn't the case at all. So I just wanted this thing to pass. But now we have this, and so when they talk about this, and I talk to folks in Hawaii, they say, we have a responsibility now. And we have a responsibility to our languages, and we have a responsibility to other places where this hasn't happened. So we're always eager to share how we did it. All we did was added a little bit of language there. There was a second part that said the government is not obligated to print everything in all 20 languages, which we were fine. So now we have a number of organizations involved at various levels with our languages. So we have tribes, corporations, heritage organizations, and it goes on and on. And these were just things that I was just thinking of on the way up here. And so with all these different organizations, and with all these different moving parts, what's the answer to getting these parts to move together? Which is a big sort of question. It's a big thought because in our region, we ought to have 10 different groups that are working on the language. And 5 of them might be doing the exact same thing. So some of the things that we're trying to figure out is how do we pool those things together so we're a little bit more efficient with our time. But the other side of this is that we're in an era where there's a lot of different things that are going on. So I was filming my Auntie Nora, and she said, she was talking, and we were making this movie about her work, and she said, the power of Shingit is so wonderful. If it's on your side and you're going to do good things with it, I think we have a blessing of some kind mingling among us to keep going and keep learning and keep teaching. So some of the things I was thinking about, PhD David Katzig, he said, life is always hard. You are not going to quit. And he broke down these 4 house posts of Tlingit knowledge. And so on the northwest coast, we would build these clan houses like this. It would be these big house posts on the inside. And that would be the foundation of the whole sort of the structure. And so I thought about what he said, and I thought, well, there's these sort of 4 realms, 5 right in the middle, but you can have these 4 house posts of language revitalization. And I think if you really want to revitalize languages, you have to change the fabric of society. So you have the institution, you have the economy, you have the community, you have the household, and you have the individual. So in the institution, it can be a wide number of institutions, but you have to create radical change at each of these levels. And I think talking with people and thinking about these things and some of the things that we're trying to execute with our own tribe, I want to share some ideas of what those things could be. And a lot of it involves more indigenous control in each of these areas. And indigenous control in Alaska, I think, means a rejection of the idea that you have to live under somebody else's value systems 100% of the time. And so it takes a lot, I think, to liberate yourselves as leaders, as organizations, as thinkers, to be able to get to this area. But if you could, then I think you've got a safe place built for your languages. Because the thing is, we have to rebuild those places. I was talking with somebody and I said, you know what? I don't think there's a single place right now where Tlingit is the language of choice. It's the primary language. And then one of my colleagues, he said, well, there's this married couple in Angoon. They both speak Tlingit. And I said, oh, well, maybe that's the only house. Because a lot of the households, we celebrate a lot of 90th birthdays with our speakers. And that means we have a lot of widows at this point, or perhaps they're married to non-speakers. And so we're thinking about immersion. So one of my teachers, that's she says, put them in immersion. Speakers starve, and then they're going to speak. So this is a photo of the youngest student I saw in the Hawaiian Language immersion schools. 6 months old. 6 months old, they got them in the schools, and they go all the way up to 12th grade in a total immersion setting. So some of the things I was thinking about is, if you wait for change, it'll never come. And a system, and that system is Alaskan Education, designed to destroy families, languages, and cultures, cannot be fixed, but must be replaced. The genius of our people is limited by self-doubt and by allowing others to control our education and therefore our destiny. And I think Alaska can become right up there with leaders in language revitalization. And I think the answer to that is self-governed education. Because there's no sovereignty that compares to thinking in your own language. So coming back to these 4 house posts, so what do? So in the institution, you build your own institutions. And I think those could be done in partnership. And I think the time is right to do that. But you have to bring self-governance into it. You can't have a conditional type of self-governance from a tribal perspective, from the Alaskan Native perspective. You have to also decolonize the existing systems and demand equality. You have to just look on paper and say, we have to learn this, this, and this. That means other people should be learning these things from our perspectives and our languages. And they should be specific to the region that they're in. For the economy, we're working with our tribe to try and create some changes, even if they're just slight changes. 2 people apply for a job with our tribe, and if they're equally qualified, but one speaks the language and one doesn't, we see the language as a qualification. And it doesn't matter what job, what position it is. I think if we start doing that, and then I think another sort of more aggressive level would be to say there's a pay scale, and then there's a pay scale for people who can speak our language, and you just make more money. And so if you're a tribe or a tribal organization, you can do that. You can set those standards. And then for the household, we're trying to bring it back into our home. So Barbara Meek is a linguist, and she said 20 years ago, the language was in the home and never in the classroom. Now the language is in the classroom and never in the home. So how do we reverse that trend? And I think one of the goals would be creating a media network for Alaska Native languages. And then the community, getting the languages back on the land, getting place names back on the land, have an expectation of knowing. Go to Hawaii, call and ask when the bus comes to a place, and see what happens if you don't know how to pronounce that place. You get embarrassed on the phone. The lady, she was mad. But I liked that. So I wanted, there was an article where somebody said, if you put Alaska Native languages, the place names back, nobody's going to know how to say that. And that's just dumb. So if we look across, we got declining state revenue. So we're all involved with the University of Alaska for now, right? And then we've got people talking about closing rural schools. We've got budget crisis. Well, I think the time is right for tribes to step in because tribes have access to funding that other organizations don't. And so this is where we get the idea of taking control, looking at the Hawaiian Language Nest, the Hawaiian medium schools, and the College of Hawaiian Language. So these are the three things that I'm studying while I'm at Hilo. But we're also in connection with Sami, Maori, and Gaelic language representatives, and all of them, they have done these things. They have built their own schools and colleges. They've started their own media production companies. They've ensured language equity through policy, and they've normalized language use in their communities. In Alaska, I think we've done one of those things. So we've got 3 more to go. This one was in Tlingit. It was really amazing when she said that. I just asked her how to say, fight for your language. And then she ended it with, there's nothing that can measure up to our language. So when we talk about a self-governed educational system, I think it's something that we would hope can exist in partnership with some of the existing systems that are out there. But it would be exercising sovereignty. And so sovereignty is the idea that we can educate the ways that we want, we can educate with the content that we want. And I think it doesn't mean that there's fears, I think. When the Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council was first talking about being formed, there was a meeting in Anchorage, and I went to that meeting. And it started out with messages from Begich, Murkowski, and they said, they were very nice messages, talking about languages. And then there was Don Young, and he said, I support this. I like, work for your languages, but don't forget about English, he said. Then he said, thanks for having me on your show. And then it ended, and we were like, what show was this? It's not like we're not going to teach them English. It's not like they're not going to speak English. So the schools that we're looking at in Hawaii have a 20-year record of a 100% graduation rate. They had similar graduation rates to that Alaska Natives do right now. They have an 80% college placement rate. They're very successful programs. And we have to think about this because without our languages, it's hard for me to fathom that we could still be indigenous people. I don't know how to sort of make that work if I can't think in an indigenous language. And it's a challenge to sort of to pose that because there are a lot of languages that are in a lot of trouble. But we can see that assimilation does not work. It doesn't create any form of success if we study what it was really intended to do and we look at what it's doing now. I don't think we should be surprised. Some people ask, why is it so hard for Alaska Native people? Why is there so much struggle? I said, you can't force people to be something that they're not supposed to be. So the model that we're exploring in Southeast Alaska, it would be contracting with the Bureau of Indian Education, running self-governance, 638 contracts to operate our own schools. And we're hoping that this is going to be successful. This would bring in an additional stream of revenue, and it would also liberate our schools from the school districts. Our school districts have not been in favor of the idea of immersion schools. We sent a student to the school board as people were running for the school board, and they had a debate. And we said, hey, just go ask them if they support the idea of a Tlingit language. And one of them said yes, and the other said no. And one of them said, because you can't teach science in Tlingit. And I said, wow, he knows Tlingit. That's amazing. I bet he doesn't have one word of Tlingit, and he can just make that racist assumption. And so it blows me away, because the level of knowledge about our landscape is phenomenal if you look at Alaskan Native languages. If we had an immersion school in our area, and we had kids that grew up in their languages, and we had kids that graduate from from the regular high school in Juneau, and if they got lost on an island or if they got lost in the woods, I think our kids would have a better chance of surviving, because they know the names of these plants, they know which ones they can eat, they know these different ways of surviving. But one of the keys is not just getting your own schools. You have to look at intergenerational trauma, the fears of failure, the types of criticisms that are intended just to cut people down, and try to overcome the idea that somehow we can't do this ourselves. I think Paul Berg, he talks about this as beaten people syndrome. You get people who are beaten down systematically over enough time, and they will believe that they cannot do it. But I think that's false. And so we can also look at healing ceremonies. I saw this with the Alaskan Native Language Preservation Advisory Council, apologizing to those who can speak for not coming by their side more often. So many speakers I go and talk to. Remember this one, she said, I haven't talked like that since my father died. I said, when did your dad die? She said, it's like 20 years ago. And I just think about growing up with a language and not being able to talk to somebody. And then apologizing to folks who grew up and they didn't have opportunities to be heard. We've got this whole generation of people that can understand Tlingit. And so when I'm at the dinner table with my auntie and I tell my kids, because I think it's funny, if you eat, and I tell them in Tlingit, if you eat your asparagus, because then your pea's going to smell funny. Because that's really funny to me. And then I get in trouble because I forget my auntie can understand. But we got to approach them and say, we're sorry for how you were treated, and that maybe people didn't listen to what you had to say. And then we have multiple generations who never had any opportunity to learn the language. And I think it's more forums to bring our people together and to think about how we get over some of these things and how to let go. Because I think if we can let go of these things, then we can have self-control. So we're really excited about, we're starting a language nest. It's starting as a Tlingit toddler time. We're getting anywhere from 12 to 20 people who are coming. We're keeping the kids in the language the whole time. It's a lot of fun. We're learning how to do this. When you do this language nest model, the thing that we were taught is, what we've been told is just make it a home environment where the language is the only language that's used. And it's very hard because we don't use our languages in our home anymore back there. So we're always teaching. We're teaching. That's how we always tend to use our language these days, except for this very small group of people that can communicate with our elders. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to change the way we look at our language. And so this finds, it leads us to changing the ways that we teach our languages as well. Because people want to be able to make jokes, and they want to be able to tease each other, and they want to be able to talk about various things. And so one of the things that we have in Tlingit is a missionization of our language. And so one of my colleagues, he said, well, that verb dictionary's got all the verbs. And I said, no, because you can't poop, you can't pee, you can't make more people. And there's ways to talk about those things because people do all of those things. And so, and the other thing is in the language, some of this stuff, it's not as embarrassing as it might be in English. And in particular, as Alaskan Native people were assimilated and missionized at the same time. And it creates a really complex set of identities. And so, and I see this when I work with certain elders, and there's stuff they won't tell me, but when everybody leaves the room, it gets really fun. right? And I just said, wow, that's how you say he played a song with his farts. You know, I could say that. So I think what we can develop, and it's going to take a monumental shift. But I think you can do this at a compact level, where you have multiple tribes engaging in a consortium of tribal schools, negotiating with the Bureau of Indian Education, and there's some hurdles. The Bureau of Indian Education has a terrible track record with Native people, with Alaska Native people. So does the state of Alaska. Senator Ted Stevens put a rider onto a bill that said the BIE will not operate schools in Alaska anymore. But we're trying to figure out, does that mean that we can't contract with them directly and get those dollars and manage it ourselves? And these are some legal gray areas that we're trying to figure out. We've got about a year or two before we want to open a school and see how it would work. I think a tribal school and trying to redefine the way that we function as schools might be one of the only chances we've got. Because if you put kids into a public school where our languages are just this optional component, I don't think it's going to create the level of fluency that we need and the number of speakers. So the three areas that I can see would be the language nest, which is really a daycare and a preschool. It's an early care area. Language medium schools, where if you follow the Hawaii model, it's K through 12. Everything is taught through the target language. You get to the 4th grade, you start teaching English 1 hour a day. It never gets more than that. You teach English through perspective of the language. So there, they teach English through Hawaii. And then the third option would be cultural immersion schools, because there might be communities that aren't ready. There might be communities that only have 1 speaker or 2 speakers. They might have 0 speakers. But maybe they can develop a cultural immersion school where the language is a legitimate part of their curriculum. And I think something like this shouldn't let the whole system off the hook. I still think if you graduate from high school in Barrow, you should have some basic abilities in Inupiat. I think if you graduate from high school in Juneau, you should have some basic abilities in Clinton. I don't see why that hasn't been on the table sooner. So the other sort of aspect of this is the tribal college model. So this is something we're also exploring between the University of Alaska Southeast and the Central Council of Tlingit Haida, where Tlingit Haida could run a tribal college through the UAS system and just develop as a school. So we have these 4 schools, and we're proposing developing a 5th school. We would have our own dean. This is what they have in Hawaii. I think it makes their program very successful, very liberated, because we could fight over curriculum and other things like that, but I think we also have to be able to have our own agenda, have our own outcomes, and I think this is a legitimate way of getting there. I think a long-term possibility could be a University of Alaska Native Languages and Studies, or whatever we wanted to call it. So as we're looking at these 4 different organizations, and these are the 4 that the Alaska Native Studies Council, they make up the Alaska Native Studies Council. We could look at some sort of unified model that has a tribal college or tribal colleges in partnership with tribes, so that we're looking at a collaborative way to decolonize the system and to create a place where the languages live and where Alaska Native ways of knowing live and are more of a foundational piece of the education puzzle. So when I look at the GER, as I said, it's like an onion of colonization. The more I look at it, because you've got picked from these lists, and the lists, there's not some list on there that has Alaska Native ways of knowing on it. And this is our land. This is where we are from. And then as I go into this list of classes within each of those things, there's hardly any in there that are, highlighting Alaska Native people or perspectives. Then as I look at how those classes are typically taught, philosophy, where I'm teaching now, is often seen as Western philosophy. And then there's a few other things that are thrown in there. And so trying to change those perspectives and say, we could have a more balanced method of delivering higher education because we're supposed to be smart. It's higher education. So as we look at, this is the good side is we bring in more money. And I think if Alaska Natives bring money to the table, we have to have control. We have to have a share in the control. And I think if there's a share in that control, there will be an increase in Alaska Native participation, attendance, retention, and graduation. I think you'll have language revitalization become a fundamental part of education, which it should. And then we'll have more homegrown leadership instead of sending people out for leadership training. We could do it all here. We reclaim our arts. We have diversified curriculum, but there's a fear. There's a fear of tribal control. There's a fear of division, right? So there's the UAF and UAA and UAS. But those, we need to be unified in some of these movements. And then there's going to be stereotypes that, someone said they're worried about. It's going to be a ghettofied type of thing. And that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So another thing, I think I got 3 slides up, real fast, is an Alaska Native Media Network. I think we're also ready for something like this. So as I go there and I look at Oiwi TV, which is a Hawaiian Language television broadcasting company, and I look at Maori TV, I look at what Gaelic is doing with the BBC, I think we're ready for something like this, whether it's an online thing or we have a channel similar to what RatNet was, or they don't know if it's still around. But where we're able to create content in our own languages and get it into our households. And I think would have to solve some broadband issues across Alaska, but I think it would be very exciting to bring folks in, to train us how to do this, to develop this capacity. It creates jobs. It also helps us tell our own stories. And when you tell your own stories, people probably, it's a more accurate version of who you are and who your people are. And I think we have to talk about accountability. So Alaska Native communities, we did not put ourselves in this situation, right? And so I remember somebody once commented on an article I wrote somewhere and said, well, Alaska Native languages just outgrew their usefulness. People just stopped speaking. And I think there are people out there who believe that. And that for the folks who went through boarding school, for the folks who were shamed, and if you want your kids to go to public school, if you wanted to vote, you had to sign an affidavit that said you were giving up your tribal ways and you weren't going to hang out with Native people. And you had to get a white teacher to sign it, and they had to find 5 other white people who would also sign it. And if you didn't, they would take your kids. And so one of my elders, Herman Davis, he's asked for a call for action against the organizations. And I think it's a tough task, but I think a lot of people who were instrumental in creating this death march for Alaska Native languages were employees of federal and state governments and directly affiliated with churches. And I was in court with a young Native man, and they said, you broke that window, you're going to pay for that window. And I think the same needs to go for the state of our languages. So this was a line, he said it in Tlingit, this is Kajapti Walter Sobolov, and it translates to don't forget our way of life, this wonderful thing that was born on the world, that saved our ancestors. Don't ever let it go. Hold on to it. It was born for us. Sheesh, that's how you can get a hold of me. Any thoughts?
So you're saying that a child should not graduate school in Barrow without some knowledge of the music?
Yeah.
That sounds very good. What about the people who want to opt out? What do you do with them? They live in Barrow. They should know that culture, just like somebody who lives in Fairbanks should, I don't know, they know what they know.
Right. I think my only thought for an opt-out would be, so when we're developing a bachelor's degree in Alaska Native Languages and Sciences or Studies, and there's a language component in it. But that language component is Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, or another Alaska Native language. So my only thought would be if there's somebody living in Barrow whose family were Gwich'in, then they would have the option of studying Gwich'in instead of Nukak if they wanted to.
So they could study another native language.
Yeah, I think you could do. My recommendation would be another Alaskan Native language, but not
Because
to just
the
say.
Hawaiians work with the ones who want, the families that want their kids to learn Hawaiian. I
Right.
think the other ones, they leave them alone.
Yeah, and that is an approach.
Yeah.
That is an approach, is to say, we'll do this ourselves, and we don't care if you're in, that's awesome, but it's not like we need to. And so yeah, that's pretty much their perspective.
Just to follow up on Larry's question, and these are great ideas. How would you, provide for teachers in these communities, especially smaller communities, where you might be lucky to have one person who's able to teach the local indigenous language?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that we've been trying, because as we were running Tlingit language classes back home, some people were getting a hold of me and saying, I don't have 600, well, it was 600 at the time, now it's 1,000. I don't have $1,000 every semester to learn my own language. And it's a weird situation with higher education to say, this is one of the only places you could learn the language. Unless you could learn Tlingit if you went and moved in with an elder. You could conceivably do an awful lot on your own. There's a lot of other different avenues you could go. We are one of those avenues. And so what we started doing was using Google Hangouts to live broadcast all of our classes, and you can watch them on YouTube for free and then archives them for free. So the only thing that holds you back there is bandwidth issues. Sometimes in Yakutat and Metlakatla, we have a hard time. But then you could have perhaps modules, or you could share teachers. I mean, one of the goals we had a strategic planning session for Southeast Alaska. One of our goals was an Alaskan Native language teacher in every community. Other thoughts?
I just thought about this, but hopefully linguists don't pick me out. But this has been always my thought. When linguists come to our communities and they take, they get information. This is just one idea regarding our language. I think that as an Indigenous researcher, one of our paradigms and methodologies is that when we go into a community to gather information, we give back. The reciprocity. So I'm thinking that another good idea, especially for my village in Northway, is that maybe they teach when they're gathering the data, maybe they can give back by having some classes there. Like that's just an idea by teaching people how to read and write the language as well.
Right. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I've always thought it was a great idea, and you linguists can kick me out if you want, but this is
I
what I've always felt that because in the Indigenous way of methodology is that it's a reciprocal relationship, and yes, thank you for the books and everything, but we can't read it. We can't read those books. How are we going to become more self-determined in our own communities?
Thank you.
How can I say they're out of here?
Well, you have a wonderful linguist who's been working with you in that way for years. You know, someone does.
Yeah.
And folks from ANLC have participated in various communities around. But literacy, but the other side of this is we can't teach a language that is not our native language. We have to spend a lot of time and energy enabling those from the community to get to the point where they can teach, and at the same time not infecting them with our own germs of academicism. And that's where I'm at anyway. And I think that most of us are there. We're not interested in taking anything away. We only want to see things grow.
So my question is mostly about, so I know that you were talking about in that earlier podcast with the Alaska legislature, but I was wondering, would it be wrong to say to have a requirement of, in high school, to have a requirement to learn a second language, to be bilingual? Would that help, or would there be a problem with, because I know in high school we only have 3 languages, Spanish, Russian, and French, I want to say. But anyway, so there was only those 3 choices. So I feel like even if you did pass that, it would still not get your languages in there because they would probably just find the already
Yeah, I think you would create more jobs for teaching Spanish, French, and Russian, and Japanese. And so I do think that there's maybe a way to approach, and it's really interesting because the language bill did pass, and then we were thinking of another charter school bill that just sort of has been fizzling around for over 2 years, almost 2 years now. And so trying to think of a piece of legislation that might look at that and say, making that a requirement, I think it should. And I think if you work for the University of Alaska, or if you're attending school, I think you should also, or if we just said 1 semester, what if you just did 1 semester? And then the goal is to try and create this equality to say, these things have been the requirement for so long, whereas these other things have been specifically driven down. And so when we talk about the things that go on in Alaska and the things that have been going on in North America and other places, it's a cultural genocide that has been legislated primarily through education. So I think education should be a vehicle that helps relieve people of some of this.
Just a comment on her, like to piggyback off the idea of high school mandates. It would be cool because they offer AP foreign languages. So I took Spanish 7th through 12th grade, and I received a test at the end of my 12th grade year for the AP language class I took. And when I passed it at a certain standard, I got 2 credits here, or basically 2 semesters of credits here at UAF. And I think it would be cool if your classes are like broadband and stuff, that the high schools would allow university credit for a student in high school who is interested in taking like an intro to Tlingit or intro to Athabascan or intro classes that they could receive, teleconference or video, and they could get high school credit and college credit.
Right, because another side to it is giving some sort of recognition to those who do, right? So like if you graduate, you can be summa cum laude, and now we'll have something even better. I don't speak Latin, but I don't even know what's higher than that. So maybe it shouldn't be Latin, but so maybe that's something you could do as well, so that if somebody can learn to speak an Alaskan Native language, they get some sort of accreditation for it that counts towards something.
One thing, so I do linguistic research in Guatemala, and one thing that they've done, which I would love to see happen here, is after they got their indigenous, like Mayan languages and the 2 non-Mayan indigenous languages recognized as also official languages, then they passed legislation that says if you are working in any government or municipal office in a predominantly, like in an indigenous area that has above a certain percentage of the population that's indigenous, you have to have language skills in that area. And so a lot of Ladinos, which are the non-indigenous Guatemalans, are, panicking, and we're upset about that, but it passed, and now all of the school teachers, it's still a struggle because there aren't necessarily good pedagogical materials in all of the languages, but they have to have some fluency in one of the languages. And so now it's become an important job qualification. And so it would be awesome if the next step in Alaska could be something like that.
Right. And then you look at normalizing the language, which is just making it part of everyday life, because it's another thing that creates a lot of trouble for endangered languages. It just gets used less often and in fewer places. And then people, they don't know how to just have day-to-day conversation. But if it can become used more and more so as you go to the DMV or as you go to Fred Meyer or wherever you go, you know that the language is going to be used. And so we have been trying that. We took a group of students to Fred Meyer for one of our classes. And we spread the word, and we had 30 people there, and we all shopped in Tlingit for 2 hours. It was a lot of fun. And it didn't happen to me. I wish it did. Somebody walked by and said, if they want to live here, they better learn how to speak English. So it was hilarious. just to let people know the language is out there. And I think over the past 5 years, with the activism that has gone on in Southeast Alaska, if you say Gunachich, I think someone's more likely to say that back to you, which is a step. But then, yeah, you want to make it more a fundamental part of it.
But also models for people in Guatemala that there are professionals that speak Mayan languages, that you are not, you know, that you are a good friend of mine who's a language advocate says, he's Maya plus. He's, you know, Maya doesn't mean that you are old fashioned, that you're not modern. He's, you know, he's a educated professional. He views it as part of his work is to model that you can be a professional and speak these languages. Great talk.
I hope that, this is great talk, and I hope that as you push for resources, that you really put your thumb down on the native corporations. We have Doyon Corporation, which is I'm a shareholder of, and there's a lot of people from this region that are shareholders of, and with assets at 787 million, I think that they have the resources to provide for language revitalization. So we shouldn't let those regional corporations off the hook. Because we talk about, if you read the preamble for Doyon, it says, you know, the river, the land speaks to me. But how many people know the language and can even hear the land? So hold those regional corporations accountable with the other people that we need to hold accountable.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And so when I first went to UAS and we had our faculty senate meeting, so here's all the faculty basically of the UAS, and I introduced myself and I said something like, well, I think we should have a bachelor's degree in Alaskan Native Languages and Studies. I think we should have our own building, and I think everybody should be learning the language here. And then one white male colleague said to another white male colleague, well, that's fine as long as the corporations pay for it. And he didn't know that colleague was like an advocate of ours. And that colleague said, who's paying for math? Who's paying for English? But ironically, that's probably the route we're going to go, is that we're going to bring our own money to the table. But with that, so we have to hold our own people accountable, whether it's tapping into these 7i funds or something else, to say there's these steady revenue streams where we could be taking 1%, or we could take 10%. We could just say we're committing this. And then when we come, and especially in these budget shortfalls, we say we're bringing our money, but we're bringing our governance with it. I think those would be two key moves.
Sorry, we're getting near the end of time. First, I want to thank you for coming to UAF and presenting to John. One thing that I'm wrestling with that ties into this conversation broadly about self-determination and K-12 education is that we import 60% of our school teachers also from outside annually. And I know the state Department of Education at one point allowed for people who had bachelor's degrees, I think have teacher certification to pass a praxis test, and then would be replaced as teachers, but then they had to work towards getting their credential to be teachers after that. So I think as you're thinking about this, you know, I think there are a lot of Alaskan people or Alaskans who would like to move home to their villages, don't have the teaching. If they have a job, especially with the economy decline, if there's a way for us to get them out there, tied into language learning and native studies, and then have programs to support them to gain whatever credentials they might need. So just some thinking about ways to help people transition home. I guess because I think even folks like myself, I would be home wanted to be a teacher.
Right. Yeah, I co-present with Paul Berg quite a bit, and he was doing some studies in Western Alaska. He found that it was $40,000 per student to educate them, which is a lot higher than I think it needs to be. And so there's the economy of it. So we could say, well, why do we got to bring in all these experts from different places when we could grow our own? I looked at this one community and I saw the average income for the Alaska Natives was below $20,000, and for non-natives it was 6 figures, right? And so we've got these really crazy colonial dynamics still going on. And I think one of the things that you could look at as well is you could say, there are teachers in certain communities who say, my Alaska Native male students, half of them never reached the age of 30. There was a teacher And she said she had counted and she was well over 100 suicides of former students. And so at some point we have to say, economically, psychologically, spiritually, and physically, we cannot afford this system anymore. And I think it's going to take a resounding voice that says we reject this system, but we are happy to supplement it with one that's better.
On the Doyon Foundation Facebook page, they're doing a survey about language revitalization.
I've already taken it.
Oh,
Also
okay.
spoken to the director who's sitting right by you. And I would say that 100,000, less than 100,000 that they give them is just it's actually less than 1% of 1% of their total assets. So let's think about that. Less than 1% of 1%. That's how much money you get for language revitalization for 11 languages.
And there's only one.
I think there's a lot of room for coalition building. Like, I want to say that thank Anabasi. This presentation gives me, I'm studying world development, and every time I tell people what I'm studying, they say, what are you going to do with that? Like, even Native people don't understand the importance and weight of language saving people and culture. And I think it's super exciting to drop the fear, drop the fear of all these ideas of taking accountability and responsibility to teach our own people, to build coalitions with to understand the systems that are in place and the resources that are out there and try to build collaboration. So really appreciate your talk.
Sheesh. Yeah, when we were doing the testimony for that House bill, one of our elders, she said, our language saved us. It just stuck with me so much. Okay. Sheesh.